paradoxically they have got higher BMD values. The fragility fracture in type 2 diabetes patients could be due to cortical thinning of bones accelerated by microangiopathy. The higher BMD values could be due to hormonal factors like insulin, leptin, and also could be due to deposition of advanced glycosylation end products. With advancing age, there is decreased calcium absorption from the gut. So, our main objective of the study is to identify the potential risk factors of hip fracture among postmenopausal women with type 2 diabetes mellitus. Moreover, to identify and validate a T-score threshold for postmenopausal women with type 2 diabetes mellitus as a risk factor for hip fracture. Regarding the methodology, this is a case control study done in Believers Church Medical College Hospital, Kerala, over a period of 2 years. The study population included postmenopausal women with type 2 diabetes mellitus. Cases were those with hip fracture, controls were those without hip fracture. The sample size we arrived at was, we used osteoporosis as one of the risk factors for hip fracture. The sample size we calculated it to be 210, which included 70 cases and 140 controls. The risk factors considered in the study were osteoporosis was assessed using DEXA values, demographic data was taken, calcium parameters including dietary intake and biochemical values were taken, and comorbidities like dementia, cataract, hearing impairment were assessed. A logistic regression model was used to identify the independent risk factors. Among the demographic details, as you can see, age is proven to be a significant risk factor. Among the anthropometric values, none of them were statistically significant. With respect to comorbidities, Dovagas, hump, kyphoscoliosis and suspected dementia had very few cases, so those were not included in the model. Cataract was proven to be a significant risk factor, but only at the p-value of less than 0.1. And hearing impairment was proven to be a very much a significant risk factor. Among the calcium parameters, neither the dietary intake nor the biochemical values were statistically significant. When we consider this DEXA values, spine BMD was statistically significant, femoral neck T-score and Z score were statistically significant. So to arrive at a threshold, we constructed an ROC curve discriminating those with and without hip fracture. Using Evidence J index, the cutoff we arrived at was -3. But that was not clinically helpful. So considering the sensitivity and specificity of various cutoff values, see, as you can see, as the sensitivity increases, specificity was continuously decreasing. So we chose a threshold value of -2 because it had high sensitivity and acceptable specificity rates. So the potential risk factors identified in the study were femoral neck T-score of -2. Those who had the femoral neck T-score of less than or equal to -2 had 3.1 times more risk of sustaining a hip fracture. And the advancing age of more than 72 years, 72 years in the study was a median age. Those above that cutoff value had 2.1 times more risk of sustaining a hip fracture. And hearing impairment, as you can see, those who had hearing impairment had 3.9 times more risk of sustaining a hip fracture, and this was supported by a study done in Sweden and North Korea with larger sample size. Cataract was a risk factor, but it was significant only at the p-value of less than 0.1. Since the lower limit of confidence interval was 0.9, we expect this may become significant at the end of the study. So the limitations of the study were, this is an interim analysis of an ongoing study. More risk factors may be significant at the final analysis. Since many elderly patients were accompanied by paid caretakers rather than their own family members, we had difficulty in getting consent from the dementia patients, so many dementia patients had to be excluded from the study. Many with multiple comorbidities like congestive cardiac failure on oxygen support were excluded because their condition did not allow them to be screened using DEXA scan. So in conclusion, postmenopausal women with type 2 diabetes mellitus with a cutoff value of -2 for femoral neck T-score had a very high sensitivity and acceptable specificity rates. Hearing impairment is a potentially correctable risk factor associated with fracture in this population. Women above the age of 72 years is a high-risk group for fragility fracture. These are the references. Thank you.
So as you noticed, I think one of the key points we learned through the study was that hearing impairment is a huge risk factor. And we normally think of visual impairment as a risk factor for hip fractures, right? And we talk to the patients and their caretakers. Very often, there may be a little water there near the bathroom, and they will call Amachi, you're going to fall, but she will not hear. And sometimes we don't realize. And that is probably a greater importance than even giving more medications to strengthen the bones for osteoporosis. And so that's something which came out very uniquely in this study and which has been affirmed as well in other studies. And I think that is one of the key takeaways we have apart from the advancing age. Normally we use -2.5 on the DEXA scan as a cutoff to start bisphosphonates, alendronate, zoledronic. But in diabetics, because they have a falsely high BMD, we can be fooled into a sense of security thinking it's all okay. But when your cutoff even goes below -2, we should be starting treatment. So these are the two major takeaways I thought I want to highlight. So we'll go on to the next presentation and we'll take questions at the end in the interest of time, okay? For those of you who came late, this is the Congress which we attended where we made these presentations. So I want to just give a little introduction to Dr. Sangeetha's study just to set the platform for her to do the presentation. So the study which Dr. Sangeetha, myself, Dr. Alice David, and we also had collaborators from Bristol Medical College, Dr. Thomas Paul and Dr. Krupa, who collaborated with us in study. And I think they say, no, teamwork is the best. Together, everyone achieves more. When we tapped into the resources and the expertise they have, we were able to come out with a study which would have far exceeded what we could have done alone. That's something we learned. So this is a study which Sangeetha will present in 8 minutes in a short while. But I just want to say, one of the first things I want to talk about, just so that I see medical students here as well, is what is this continuous glucose monitoring system? This is a game changer in the field of diabetes. Normally, we have been traditionally checking finger sticks, blood sugar values to decide whether somebody's sugar is under control or not, apart from the HbA1c. But today, a test which has become available for the last 5 to 10 years. In fact, 10 years ago in England, we used to use this regularly, but it was very expensive to do it in India. So this test costs about 2,800 rupees. This is a picture of the ambulatory glucose report. Can you see at the top left corner, it says AGP. This is the ambulatory glucose target. We get a continuous measurement of the glucose every 15 minutes from your interstitial fluid. And that is a good reflector of the blood sugar value. And we use AGPs through 24-hour periods for up to 2 weeks if you attach this sensor. How many of you have seen this sensor? Can you put up hands? I can see Dr. Elizabeth. Many of you have put up CGMs. For those of you who have not seen this, you must come to our department and see it. It's a small sensor. It measures the blood sugar values over a 2-week period, and then we can identify actually what the sugar pattern is. And this is a summation graph over 2 weeks, which will say, so every day we'll see whether they had hypoglycemia, how much of the time. If you see the right side, you can see here, very, very high sugars were 98% of the time in this particular one of our patients, and she had very lows, very low time, but most of the time her blood sugars were high. This is a report will say how the time in target. Can you see the green part of the graph? That is the period. We want at least the patient to have 70% of the time in a 24-hour period, the sugar should be under control. Whereas that's not the case we see in many of our type 2 and type 1 diabetes. So that's called the time in range. How much time a person's sugar is under control. And then we have time below range is the red part, time above range is yellow, and this will give us a summation graph of the entire glycemic control. Diabetic control is not only to be measured by HbA1c. We have to look at the glycemic variability. How much the sugar, how much of the time the patient spends in hypoglycemia in a day, how much time they spend in hyperglycemia, and that helps us to get a better picture of the person's diabetic control. 50% of sugar control is assessed by glycemic variability, and the AGP or the CGM is a very good way to assess the sugar control. So if you look at this particular graph, can you see the bottom graph? Can you see there are areas, the gray band in the center is the time between 70 to 180 milligram per deciliter. That is the ideal sugar control. But you see the graph spiking and going up with the yellow part? That is the part which says that is the periods when the sugar goes up. And you can even plot the time when the sugar goes up. Is it immediately after breakfast? Is it immediately after lunch? And you can identify, is there a pattern in a particular person's life, assuming the food is more or less constant, when there's a tendency to go up. And all of us, our body physiology is so different. It doesn't behave the same way. So we can identify. Can you see the red parts below 70? Yes, below 70 is when the time the sugars goes low. And sometimes patients don't even recognize they're having low sugar. So this AGP is a very useful tool to assess silent, unrecognized hypoglycemia. Not all hypoglycemias you may get symptoms. If somebody keeps on getting recurrent hypos, there is a sort of a lowering of the threshold, and people will not get the autonomic symptoms of hypoglycemia. They may straight away become unconscious, the neuroglycopenic symptoms. That is why it's useful to do the AGP. So what happened is about close to a year ago, Dr. Sangeetha wrote up a proposal to the ICMR about assessing whether many of these children who have type 1 diabetes, do they have hypoglycemia unawareness. And she will explain what the definition of unawareness is later. But I just want to tell you, this particular project was accepted by the Indian Council of Medical Research as a good study, and there are many components of the study which I will request Sangeetha to just say a few words. But basically this study gave us an opportunity to connect with various parts of Kerala state. In fact, every district of Kerala, Sangeetha with her connections and networking was able to establish camps in various parts of Kerala. We went to at least 5 or 6 centers, and we had the privilege to have Dr. George Chandy sir also with us to come along for few of these camps. We had diabetes educators. Maybe I request our diabetes educators, Sister Mariam and Sister Deepa, if you could just stand up. They were also the ones who also accompanied us. We had Ebi, yes, they were the ones who did a lot of the thing. Ebi is the coordinator. Can I request the other CABS trial members just to stand up, just to acknowledge there was a huge team involved in successes. Jyoti from dietary department and her colleagues, and we had social workers, friends, Sangeetha, and many of them were taking part in the study to lead to the success. Dr. George Chandy and Dr. Sangeetha were also there. So you will get to talk about it. So this is the first picture. Please sit down. So this is the first camp we did in Kollam. So actually in the Kollam, and if you can see, can any of you identify who is the chief guest there in that particular slide? Yes, so well known, the MLA, Sri Mukesh, was there in this particular. He's listening very intently to the presentation. This is the next camp we went to Kozhikode, and we have the Member of Parliament, Mr. M.K. Raghavan sir, who was there, as well as representatives from the 24 News channel and the Rotary Club representative, Dr. Chitra Pradeep, who's a homeo practitioner. And then there's a third one. We went near Kannur to Payanur, and that's where Prashant Mani, who is one of the secretaries of the Type 1 Diabetes Foundation, the man in the blue t-shirt, he's a Type 1 diabetic himself, and he's on a CGM, and he is a very passionate Type 1 diabetes advocate. He talks about it. These are many of the children we had a picture with in the bottom frame, all the Type 1 children who came for the camp, because all these Type 1 children just check sugars by finger sticks. 2,800 to 3,000 rupees, not everybody can afford for a CGM. So we were giving it free of charge as part of this project. So that is the attraction for them to come. And after finishing the 2 weeks, they would mail it to us by post, and we would analyze the ambulatory glucose profile. This is the fourth camp we did in Tripunitora. That is Sangeetha standing next to the Princess of Jaipur, Ms. Rajkumari Padmaja Kumari, Her Royal Highness Padmaja Kumari was there, as well as Mrs. Usha Srikandan Nair, the Chief Manager of Flowers Channel, and Dr. V.P. Gangadharan sir is there in the bottom panel. You can see he was the chief guest for this, along with the Rotary Club president. This is the fifth one we did in the Muslim Association Hall in Palayam, in Trivandrum. We had the retired the Chief Justice Alexander Thomas, who is now in the Human Rights Commission, who was the chief guest, along with people in the lay public, Dr. Mohammed Mansoor, who is the CEO of Al Muqtadir Gold and Diamonds, who supported this program. So that it involved a lot of public networking and support. I must say hats off to Sangeetha for the lot of hard work which went. Shall we give her a hand for getting the study together? It wouldn't have been possible without the energy, enthusiasm, picking up with a lot of disappointments, late night phone calls to sustain this program. Otherwise, this wouldn't have seen the light of day. These are all the newspaper clippings which came as a result of this project, which led to a fair amount of visibility for our institution and the projects we do. This is Mr. Raghavan addressing the community after the Calicut program. This is Mukesh ji and the team at Kollam. That's Gangadharan sir and other senior. This is Dr. Ramesh, who is a gastroenterologist actually, who came for the program at Tripunitura. And this is all the various publicity in Manorama and other newspapers. And then this program is not started. This is just one part of the study which Sangeetha will present. There's a cognitive element, assessment of the children's cognitive functions due to recurrent hypos. We're going to talk about it later. And we also continue to do online webinars. We have already finished 5 or 6 webinars which Sangeetha and the entire team has organized. The first webinar, if you can notice, was on 26th October. You can see the date. Introduction to Type 1 Diabetes. And that's Reshma giving a talk in the webinar where many of the parents of children, more than 100 to 200 children, and the parents take part in this particular webinars. This is another one on psychology of type 1 diabetes, and Dia is the one who's also been involved in the initial stages. Now we have Roshni supporting us in that. That's Roshni giving a talk and having taken a lot of Q&As, question and answer sessions. This is the third webinar we did on 10th of November, Reshma teaching them about dietary management. And this is not just one-off, it's not a hit and run thing. We are with the families over the next few years to support them in whatever way possible. This is just screenshots of that. And this is the role of fiber and hydration in managing blood sugar. Reshma is leading this. Jyoti did another one. And we just show you some pictures. This is the one on 19th December. This is on 8th of January. You can see the dates. And that's just an intro I wanted to give you. I want to set the stage for Sangeetha to do her presentation on one aspect of her study, which we will do is about hypoglycemia unawareness and what the state is. Over to you, Sangeetha.
Good morning to one and all. I thank the organizers of the quest for giving me an opportunity to present here. I am grateful to George Andy sir and Philip Finney sir for being with me throughout through the entire journey of the project and helping us to do extremely well in terms of running of the project. I'm extremely grateful to you, sir and Philip Finney sir. So this project began almost a year ago, when we decided to do a project on children with type 1 diabetes, and we wrote to the ICMR, and we were lucky enough that we were granted this project. And as a result, as Philip Finney sir said, we did multiple programs across the state of Kerala. And finally, this project is just not about assessing the hypoglycemia unawareness in children with type 1 diabetes, but it has more important things to it as well. So what we are aiming through this project is that it is actually a randomized controlled trial wherein one part of the project, that is a phase 1, is assessment of 600 children with type 1 diabetes across the state of Kerala and looking for their hypoglycemia unawareness. The second phase of this project is we're going to screen out those children who had hypoglycemia unawareness, and we are going to pick 150 of them through randomization, and we are going to give them targeted interventions. Interventions means cognitive interventions, dietary interventions, frequent endocrinology consultations in order that they get over these problems of frequent swings of hypoglycemia and hyperglycemia, and eventually they will be able to have a more or less a stable blood glucose levels, and therefore they will have a reduced probability of complications in later life. So that is just the project all about. So now coming to my topic which I presented in CMC. Do we all have kids? At least 90% of them would have kids. Okay. Most kids worry about making friends and passing exams. But children with type 1 diabetes, they have a far more daunting challenge, that is to stay alive. Imagine a world wherein your body constantly betrays you, constantly threatening to shut down without giving any warning signs. This is a reality of children with type 1 diabetes. Remember that India accounts for most of the children with type 1 diabetes in South Asia. And there is an increase of 5% of cases every year. Hypoglycemia unawareness is defined as the inability to perceive symptoms when the blood glucose level falls below 70 milligram per deciliter. The prevalence of hypoglycemia unawareness is as high as 40% in adults with type 1 diabetes as per Western literature. To the best of our knowledge, there is no data regarding the prevalence of hypoglycemia unawareness among Indian children with type 1 diabetes. There is no data. So, what is the problem? Why do we have to study about hypoglycemia? Hypoglycemia episodes, they are known to cause cognitive and behavioral problems in children apart from the long-term complications caused by hyperglycemia. So that is why we did this project. So this, as I already told you, this result is just the end of the phase 1 of the project. And in this phase 1, our objectives were to assess the prevalence of hypoglycemia, hypoglycemia unawareness, and various blood glucose parameters in children with type 1 diabetes using a continuous glucose monitor. The second objective was to estimate the HbA1c and lipid profile in children with type 1 diabetes. So we used a cross-sectional study, and 600 children between the ages of 6 to 18 years with type 1 diabetes across the state of Kerala were included in the study. We had children from all the 14 districts of the state of Kerala. And we did this first phase during April to August 2024 using a continuous glucose monitoring system by Abbott Libre. That is the Freestyle Pro CGMS system for 2 weeks. So this system we can affix to the deltoid of the child, and it gives reading for 2 weeks. And we use the goal scoring system for estimating hypoglycemia unawareness. So what is this goal scoring system? It asks this question: are you aware of when your hypos are commencing? So if sometimes you are aware, then you directly go into the classification for hypoglycemia unawareness. So how did we implement this project? So we contacted the MITAI program. It's a state-owned program for children with type 1 diabetes. But the problem with this program is that only kids or their parents who have an annual income of less than 2 lakhs would be included in the state program. So we know that for this statewide project, it is not good enough to include only children belonging to the lower socioeconomic strata because they might not be representative of the entire population. So we contacted the Diabetic Welfare Society, which works in North Kerala and Central Kerala, and the Diabetic Welfare Foundation, which works in the South Kerala. So contacting these organizations, presidents and secretaries, we were able to include children belonging to all socioeconomic strata into this program. And then we randomly selected 150 children from the 600 children and conducted blood tests for HbA1c and lipid parameters in Believers Church Medical College Hospital. So we've got this randomization list, and we've got 150 children with type 1 diabetes coming all over the state of Kerala, from Kozhikode, Kannur, Kasaragod to Trivandrum to Believers, and we give endocrinology consultation. Philippini sir does all the endocrinology consultations for these children. We have about 3 to 4 patients coming every day with us, along with psychology consultation given by Dia and Roshni. Roshni is she is trained in Sri Chitra, and she is a psychologist who works with us. And we have a dietary department with the support of Jyoti and Reshma, who we have made modules to educate the parents of children with type 1 diabetes. And Our coordinator is Mr. Ebi. He is a social worker, and along with two other people, Anoop and Abel, they do all the networking work for us. So that is how this project is functioning. And we did this data collection in both in CAM mode and in-house programs, because it's not possible to call 600 children to believers because they are in different parts of Kerala. So we had both these modes for collecting our data. And now coming to the very interesting results of this phase 1. So we find that the mean age of the participants in the study was 13.8 years, and we find a slight female predominance here with 54.5% were females. And we find that the age of onset of type 1 diabetes was 7 years, and 6.6% had concomitant hypothyroidism, which is very well known in children with type 1 diabetes. And these children, because these are all a spectrum of autoimmune disorders, so hypothyroidism, celiac disease, everything these children can have. But to our dismay, we found that just 1%, that is 6 out of 600 children, were on continuous glucose monitor. The American Diabetes Association and all the European Association for Diabetes say that people with type 1 diabetes should be on a continuous glucose monitor. But we find that just 6 out of 600 children were on continuous glucose monitoring system. And just 1 out of 600 children was on an insulin pump. So these results are important. And just out of curiosity, we asked, because they require a daily, multiple time insulin dosing. So we required if they had forgotten to take insulin doses in the preceding 2 weeks, and we found that more than 20% had forgotten to take their insulin doses, although it is a part and parcel of their daily life. And though we advocate bedtime snacking in these children, just 44% had bedtime snacking. Now look at these results. So we can hardly find the green area. So looking at these results, we can say that 83.5% of children with type 1 diabetes had hypoglycemia episodes. See, this was not a subjective monitoring. This was objective based on the CGMS report. So we see that 83.5% had hypoglycemic episodes, and out of that, 98%, more than 98% were unaware of when their episodes were happening. You might be wondering, how can you give such a result? But I'll tell you very clearly, most of these episodes, the children were unaware, were nightly hypoglycemia. They occurred at night, and the children were unaware of it. So what happens? These low hypoglycemia puts them at an increased risk of cognitive dysfunction in later life. Now, looking at the ambulatory glucose profile in children with type 1 diabetes, we find that just 20%, almost 20% had a well-controlled diabetes of HbA1c less than 7, while more than about 80% of the children had uncontrolled type 1 diabetes. And you will find that more than about 90% of the children had very high blood glucose level, that is more than 250 milligram per deciliter for more than 5% of the time per day. They had 90% had such high blood glucose levels. Okay, the allowed target is just 5% of the time, but they had it more, 90% had it more. And those children with very low blood glucose level of less than 54 milligram per deciliter, 66% had it. All right, and just 4% of the children were within the time and target range required. That is, more than 70% of the time they had to be in between 80 to 180, and that was just 4% of the children. And look at the time and target range in hours, I have said. The recommended time that a child has to be in the target range of 70 to 180 is 16 hours. But it's just 8 hours that an average a child spends. And time in very high range, that is more than 250 milligram per deciliter, a child remains for that high range for more than 8 hours, while the recommended time is just 1 hour. That is 8 times more. And then the time spent in very low range was 48 minutes, while the allowed time is less than 14 minutes, which is 3.5 times more. And the average number of low glucose events that is happening for this duration of CGM, that is, it's 10. That means every day they will have at least one hypoglycemic events, and they will have as high as 42 hypoglycemic events per day. And the mean duration of low glucose events was 117 minutes. And there was a high variability in blood glucose. That means it swings from a very high level to a very low level, and it's present in 43.3% was the variability found, while the allowed variability was to be less than 36%. And so we were just curious to see if the duration of hypoglycemia, could it predict hypoglycemia unawareness? And we found an ROC curve which is excellent at discriminating between those who had hypoglycemia unawareness or not based on the duration of hypoglycemia. So if on the CGM report, if they give an average duration of hypoglycemia that they had was 57 minutes, we can say that the child is more likely to have hypoglycemia unawareness. If you remember my previous slide, it shows the average duration is 117 minutes. Okay, and this had a very high sensitivity of 92% and specificity of 87%. And when we look at the differences in glucose parameters in children with and without hypoglycemia, this is a very normal finding. We see that those children with hypoglycemia, they had an estimated HbA1c which was lower, a glucose variability which was higher, and an age diagnosis which is slightly lower than those children without hypoglycemia, and all these results were statistically significant. Now, looking at the laboratory estimation of HbA1c and lipid profile, this is even more bad, much more worse than the CGM report. And we see here that just 10% of the children had well-controlled type 1 diabetes. And 40%, close to 40%, had an abysmally poorly controlled diabetes with an HbA1c more than 10. And we find that 34% of children had high cholesterol levels, and 66% of children had elevated LDL levels, and 1/4 of them had elevated triglyceride levels. So, coming to the end of my presentation, my take-home messages are that 85% of children have hypoglycemic episodes, and more than 98% of them are unaware. The proportion of children with very high blood glucose level was more than 90%, and proportion of children with very low blood glucose level, less than 54 milligram per deciliter, was 66%. And the proportion of children with time in range, more than 70%, was just 4%. And the mean HbA1c of these children was 9.6, and almost close to 40% have HbA1c above 10, and 66 had elevated LDL levels. Therefore, finding a solution for this problem is of paramount importance, not because of just its negative consequences, but because we realize that there is a potential for improvement. Let me just conclude by this statement. We all know the struggle of forgetting to charge our mobile phones, don't we? Okay. Now imagine a child whose life literally depends on a constant, vigilant source of energy, and that source requires constant monitoring and adjustment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sangeetha. Before we ask Sangeetha and Indra to come forward and take questions from you, I'm going to hand over the mic to Dr. George Shandy, sir, who has been a pillar of support for this particular project.
Thanks, Philip. I hope that all of you really got excited about what you heard from Indra and Sangeetha. 20 years ago, one of the leading scientists in India is a guy called Jacob John. He told me in CMC Vellore, we can't, ini thottu angane adhigam velliya research India il cheyan okkathilla because it has all become high technology. And if we don't have the high tech, we can't do seminal, meaningful research. So when Sangeetha came up with this idea, it was so exciting. You've seen the movie Tare Zameen Par. You've seen the movie Tanmatra. here is an idea which nobody in the world has thought of. That these children at night, when they are struggling with the parents, what is happening? And the study gives some answers to that. So the first thought I have to share with you is that all of us, if we think, there might be ideas like this which nobody has thought about. The second thing I wanted to share with you is how using an idea, this team has connected with the whole state. So the believer's name is everywhere in the state because of an interest taken. And when you see the parents of the children, you realize that they're just looking for hope. So Sumit's wife is going to be our legal advisor. We want this idea patented, please, because this should not be misused. This has to be taken all the way so that the world gains from it. You know how the pharmaceutical industry and all that can mismanage all this. So it's very important to patent it so that all of you can continue to work on this and have something much more meaningful. The third was, last Saturday for me was a very exciting day. To see Philip take a team from here to at the highest level at an international conference where there were how many foreign 30 faculty, and many of them at the highest level of endocrinology, many of them sequestered away into some resort where they were planning some big things for the future of the world, for endocrinology. But there I saw 8 of them, and I was excited. Can I see all of you here, please? Anju and team. And I want to present this to medicine, to surgery, to all the other departments. I would have loved to see a lot of preclinical people here today. Because for me, I thought we had achieved. To see this group representing believers, how would you, I don't know whether I would have had the guts, as Philip had, to take a team from here, to go to this group of people who are just absolutely top-class people. They had posters, they had presentations, and God, in His wisdom, gave us the 2 top prizes that were given out there. So shall we give them a big hand, and thank you to Philip and the whole team, because you have done us proud. I hope I'll be able to present more and more people like this from other departments going for other conferences. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to open the forum for questions. I'm sure some of you have questions. We have just about 5 minutes, maybe. You can just ask quick, short questions or comments. That will be helpful. Yes, Dr. Gillis. Sorry, Dr. Chepsi is first. He put up his hand first, ma'am. Next is he.
Thank you, sir. Congratulations to the entire team. It's really inspiring to see this kind of work. So I just had a question for the on field. How did you translate how did you get the connect with Northern Kerala? And how did you get over this inhibition, or that is what I feel, the inhibition of engaging private medical colleges with society? There's some inhibition is what I feel. How did you get over that?
It was actually a very long journey. To begin with, I was lost where to start with, because getting 600 children with type 1 diabetes within my age of 6 to 16 years was quite difficult, because type 1 diabetes is not that very common here. But we have close to 100 children with type 1 diabetes, but they don't particularly belong to this age group where I can try out cognition interventions and dietary interventions and all. So I contacted the Kerala Social Security Mission, because I'm community medicine, so I have a little bit of community connect. So I contacted the Kerala Social Security Mission's that chief and asked her, what can I do? What support can I get from the Kerala government for this project? So she said, Doctor, we can give you a list of children that we have, but the problem is they all belong to a very low socio-economic status. Then I was thinking, no, that would not be a correct representation of my population, because those people, they really can't afford insulin, very short-acting insulins and CGMs, and therefore they will have a poorly controlled diabetes, and my results will all be skewed. So I was thinking, well, how else can I navigate this? And I asked her, do you know about anything else that I could do to work with these children? So she was the one who said that there is an association in the north and a society in the south, and could you please contact them? Then I had to do a lot of phone calls, multiple phone calls, to get the state president and the secretaries, to get their entire team involved. And you would just not believe that all these, the conference, the sort of workshops that we had at different districts in Kerala, we didn't have to organize for anything. We didn't spend the money in organizing the food or the venue. Everything was taken care of by the society and team. It's because we had done a lot of Zoom calls at night. At around 9:30, I would get these leaders and I would tell them what this project is about. And they used to ask a lot of questions, particularly because it's a private medical college, what other hidden agenda did you have for this project? So I used to give answers over the Zoom meetings multiple times every night for almost 3 months. And then finally I had them on board. And then I conducted district-wise meetings with the parents of children with type 1 diabetes, district-wise meeting, and I convinced them that we are going to have programs in all over Kerala. Would you please come and attend just for once? And then they all came, and then that is how we were actually so excited to see we had huge crowd of 500, 600 parents and children, and everything was taken care of by the grace of God, abundant grace of God, because initially we thought we'll just confine this project to 2-3 districts, but then it just went overboard. Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Being a clinician, I want to ask a clinical question. Now it is told in your study that very low blood glucose was 54%. That is very accurate because it is monitored. Now in children, I have seen, I've followed up at least 5 children till the age of 5 years with these diabetes. And getting low hypoglycemia symptoms is what matters. So in this study, did you get any history? Was there any neuroglycopenia? When the blood sugar comes down, we all get sympathetic activity. There's a dawn phenomenon, because of which there's a reactionary increase in cortisol and growth hormone. That is the reason most of the time will not be able to give a history of having seizures or some restlessness, sleep, incontinence or anything in these children. So did you have anything? It's very interesting if it is there.
Yes, so we had inquired about these children are they aware at times? So most of the children, during the daytime, they would have fatigue when their blood sugar levels come down, and a few of them had giddiness, and they were not really active at that time. But in stark contrast, we could kind of find a few children who were very irritable, and they were just exploding with their parents when asked to do something in response. So that was also a sort of a response. Irritability is something that I didn't know that could present as a consequence of hypoglycemia, but it did. And some of them even had reported some nightmares and nightly events at a few times, a few episodes. Yeah.
No, but basically these are subjective, no? So
Yes.
Was there sweating? Was there tremor?
Yeah.
Pallor?
So that's what I said, ma'am. At
There,
night,
the mothers could not relay this, but the symptomatic is very common. All of us have
yes,
this.
at night they were not aware of any of these symptoms. But during the day, occasionally they complained of sweating and other autonomic symptoms as well, shakiness.
See, first, a newly diagnosed diabetic child is by standard supposed to be admitted, and we show them in the ward what is it to experience hypoglycemia, and we teach the mother how to monitor, how to correct. That is part of the initial education.
Yes, but ma'am, we must remember that the type 1 diabetes is very poorly managed in Kerala, and we have just a single endocrinologist from all over Trivandrum to Kottayam. There's one just single endocrinologist, and I talked to him, and he said he manages 300 patients per day. So how are you going to admit them? How are you going to teach them? And also in the study, we included children who had type 1 diabetes and who were on insulin for at least 6 months.
This idea of the study was we really don't know what is happening to these children over a 24-hour period. The intention here was primarily to see what is the magnitude of the problem. We know that at the lower sugar values, ambulatory glucose profile results are not very accurate, no? Because they can be, but still this is the first time we have data to say that it's going down. The if you keep on getting recurrent hypos, the brain's threshold goes down, and they will never have the autonomic symptoms in hypoglycemia. They will straight away go into unconsciousness or seizures. That is the fear we have. So now that we have documented it, then the standard of care, the treatment is raise the threshold. No, you tell them to allow sugars to be higher so that they will regain their awareness. That's what we used to do. But now I think we have to see that it's such a big problem, what we can do. So the second part of the study we will present shortly as to what is the prevalence of cognitive dysfunction in these children. That will come as maybe another quest we will present. We have just been doing psychological and neurological assessments for these kids, and we will present that. We can take any other questions. Anybody else? Yes, Dr. Joseph John and Dr. Mohan and Varghese, and then we stop because it's time. Yes.
Autonomic dysfunction probably maybe developed in these particular patients.
Yes.
That you should assess it.
Sure.
And only you will be able to assess the why they developed the neuroglycopenic symptoms, because the counter-regulatory hormone may not be functioning because of the lack of autonomic functions.
So in adults, we have an entity for the students. We are saying it's called HAF, hypoglycemia associated autonomic failure. This is a big problem we have. When you have recurrent hypoglycemia, it can lead to autonomic dysfunction, HAF. But we have not much data on children, how common HAF is. Yes, Dr. Joseph.
A question to Professor Indra. Everyone seems to have ignored her so far. It's really good that you brought up the idea of hearing disability and the risk associated with falls in the elderly. Once Dr. Philip Finney talked to me, it was pretty surprising that this was such an entity that could possibly increase the risk of falls. Just in your study, how many of these people had a vitamin D deficiency alongside with, because it's a correctable factor of autosclerosis and other sensory neural hearing loss due to, which is more profound in vitamin D deficiency?
Sir, vitamin D deficiency, since we took the biochemical parameters, irrespective of cases and controls, many of them had vitamin D deficiency, and they were not on proper supplements also. That's why it was not statistically significant. If you want to show the exact values, I can show it.
No, it's fine.
So that is definitely there, vitamin D. But if you look at that, this is a case control study, right? We compared the cases who had fractures, those who didn't have. And we found there was no difference in the mean vitamin D value, whether they had a fracture or they didn't have a fracture. But definitely it may be a contributing factor, but we couldn't demonstrate that it's more vitamin D deficiency among those who fell and fractured versus those who didn't fracture. Okay, so I think we will reserve, if any of you have questions, you're welcome to come and talk to us after the quest. So thank you very much for all of you for coming. And shall we just give a round of applause to all the team members who did this. Thank you, and see you next week, same time, same place.